Andersonville Prison, Camp Sumter, 1864. The dream of construction, the blueprint of inhumanity. The narrative begins. The winter of 1864. The American Civil War had reached a bloody stalemate. Despite decisive Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the Confederacy tenaciously fought on. At this stage of the war, the number of captured soldiers on both sides had soared. The major military prisons in the South, particularly those near the capital in Richmond, had swelled far beyond capacity. In response to this crisis, the Confederate government devised a plan for a colossal prison camp, a monument to strategic necessity that would quickly become a foundation for one of the darkest stains on human history, Camp Sumter, forever infamous as Andersonville. In this first part, we will explore how the Confederacy's failing economy, its urgent military needs, and fundamental flaws in planning converged to turn Andersonville into a cursed pit of human suffering, a place where the blueprint for inhumanity was drafted with wood, earth, and the Guards' rifles. 1. The prisoner crisis and the South's strategic need. From mid-1862 through late 1863, an official cartel of exchange agreement governed the exchange of prisoners between the Union and the Confederacy. A. The collapse of the exchange cartel. In mid-1863, this crucial agreement collapsed. The primary reason was the Confederacy's refusal to treat captured black Union soldiers equally, often classifying them as slaves or rebels instead of prisoners of war. Abraham Lincoln refused to tolerate this racial discrimination, effectively halting the exchange. With the cartel broken, both sides were compelled to hold on to hundreds of thousands of captured soldiers. For the struggling Southern economy, provisioning and housing such a massive influx of prisoners presented an almost insurmountable challenge. Southern pressure. The Confederacy recognized its diminishing manpower in the protracted conflict and began using prisoners of war as leverage against the Union. However, to house these soldiers, they needed a new, secure, and centrally located camp. B. Selecting the site for Camp Sumter. The Confederate authorities chose a remote area near the small town of Andersonville, Georgia, approximately 60 miles south of Macon. The site was selected for several strategic reasons. Security. Its distance from the coastline made it safe from potential surprise attacks or naval-backed incursions by Union forces. Infrastructure. It offered a direct connection to the Macon and Savannah Railroad, promising easier logistical transport of food and supplies, a promise that would tragically fail to materialize. Natural resources. The surrounding area was covered in dense pine forest, which provided readily available timber for building the massive stockade walls. Supply illusion. Officials optimistically believed the area was rich in foodstuffs and adequate water resources. In early February 1864, the land was acquired and construction of the immense prison was placed under the supervision of Captain W.S. Wirtz. 2. The prison design and fatal construction flaws. Andersonville was designed to be a simple yet highly secured enclosure. However, built in haste and with meager resources, this very design quickly became a death trap for thousands of prisoners. A. The stockade design. Initially, Andersonville encompassed a rectangular area of 16.5 acres, 67,000 square meters. The stockade. The main prison walls were constructed from thick pine logs nearly 20 feet, 6 meters, which were planted deep into the earth and sharpened at the top. A walkway was built atop this immense wall for the guards to patrol. The deadline. The most infamous element of the prison was the deadline. This was a low wooden fence erected approximately 19 feet, 6 meters, inside the main stockade wall. The Confederate military order was chillingly simple. Any prisoner touching or crossing the deadline would be shot immediately without warning. Countless prisoners, either maddened by thirst or driven by despair, deliberately crossed this line to seek death. This boundary became the ultimate symbol of Andersonville's inhumanity. Sentry boxes. Guard towers or sentry boxes were positioned along the perimeter at roughly 96 feet intervals. Armed guards monitored the enclosure 24 hours a day from these elevated platforms. B. Water source and environmental catastrophe. Planners fatally assumed that the prison would receive sufficient clean water from the adjacent stream, Sweetwater Creek. Contamination from day one. The creek ran directly through the center of the camp. However, the Confederate cookhouses and guard camps were located upstream, meaning the water was already contaminated with refuse and waste before it even entered the prison enclosure. Dual use, fatal result. Once inside the prison, the same polluted stream served as the sole source of drinking water, washing water, and, critically, the only sewer and latrine system for the entire camp population. Creation of a cesspool. The slow-moving creek quickly became a toxic cesspool of human waste and garbage. In the brutal heat of the Georgia summer, this created a disastrous breeding ground for disease. C. Lack of preparation. When the first Union prisoners began arriving in late February 1864, Camp Sumter was still under construction. There were no permanent sheds, barracks, kitchen facilities, or hospitals. All that awaited the prisoners was open ground, polluted water, and the watchfulness of armed guards. 3. The arrival and the reign of Captain Wirtz. From February to June 1864, thousands of prisoners began arriving at Andersonville by train. A. Initial arrival and shock. The first prisoners to enter the camp were stunned. They found no shelter and no means of cooking. They were faced only with mud, perimeter walls, and the raw imperative to survive. The struggle for shelter. Prisoners began digging holes in the earth, which they called dugouts. They used scavenged blankets or branches to create temporary roofs, known as shanties. But in the summer rains, these dugouts quickly filled with mud and water. Critical overcrowding. By June, the population of the 16.5-acre camp exceeded 20,000. Each prisoner was allotted barely 6 square feet of space, little more than standing room. B. Henry Wirtz, the face of the tragedy. Captain Henry Wirtz, a physician from Switzerland who had joined the Confederacy, was the commandant of Camp Sumter. His role in the camp's tragic outcome remains highly debated. Administration. Wirtz enforced strict discipline using military law and corporal punishment. Historians generally agree he was personally cruel to the prisoners. Supply chain failure. Wirtz repeatedly sent desperate reports to Confederate authorities in Richmond begging for more food, medicine, and supplies. These requests were either ignored or were impossible to fulfill due to the collapse of the Southern economy. Wirtz argued he did the best he could with non-existent resources. However, his personal harshness certainly compounded the suffering. C. The supply crisis. The Confederate supply infrastructure was collapsing. Rail lines were inadequate, and the Union blockade had crippled the Southern economy. Rations. The rations provided to the prisoners primarily consisted of poorly processed cornmeal and minimal salt. The cornmeal was often wet, contaminated, and moldy. The complete lack of vegetables or meat meant the prisoners quickly suffered from chronic vitamin and nutritional deficiencies. 4. The arrival of summer, the explosion of death and disease. The summer of 1864 brought with it the ultimate horror for Andersonville. Temperatures became unbearable, and disease and death exploded within the confines of the camp. A. Disease and malnutrition. By July and August, the average daily death rate climbed to over 100 prisoners per day. Scurvy. The near-total lack of fresh fruit or vegetables meant scurvy reached epidemic proportions. Prisoners' gums swelled, teeth loosened, and old wounds refused to heal. Dysentery and diarrhea. Due to the polluted water, chronic diarrhea and dysentery were the leading causes of death. Thousands of prisoners were weakened, ultimately dying from dehydration and exhaustion. Gangrene. Simple injuries easily turned into gangrene due to the lack of nutrition, often necessitating amputation without proper medical tools. B. Savagery and mental collapse. In this inhumane environment, basic human decency rapidly deteriorated. The stress of hunger, fear, and disease led to a profound moral collapse among the prisoners. The Raiders. A sophisticated criminal element emerged among the prisoners, calling themselves the Raiders. They preyed upon the weak and the newly arrived, forcibly stealing their food, clothing, money, and meager personal possessions. Terror. The Raiders were most active at night. Their terrorism became so effective that the fear of the Raiders often exceeded the fear of the Confederate guards themselves. The daily battle, internal terror, and the collapse of humanity. The narrative continues. Within the towering pine walls of Andersonville lay the living embodiment of hell. Survival was the only profession and the only war. Part 1 detailed the prison's flawed construction, the environmental hazards, and Captain Wirz's severe administration. Now we plunge deeper into the summer of 1864, where polluted water, chronic malnutrition, and the complete collapse of morality plunged the interior of Andersonville into primitive anarchy. This part explores the prisoners' daily struggle for the most basic needs, their silent war against disease, and the emergence of internal terrorism that came to be known as the Raiders. 1. Hunger, disease, and the body's betrayal. Every prisoner at Andersonville was locked in an unequal battle against his own body. The chronic lack of food and the complete absence of sanitation systematically destroyed their physical and mental reserves. A. The scurvy epidemic and malnutrition. The only consistent ration for the prisoners was unprocessed cornmeal, often damp, moldy, and unfit for consumption. The near-total absence of meat, fruit, or vegetables allowed scurvy to sweep the entire camp, reaching epidemic levels. Scurvy's toll. Scurvy was a silent, debilitating killer. Prisoners' gums swelled, their teeth loosened, and internal hemorrhaging began under the skin. Old wounds would reopen and refuse to heal. Many men lost the ability to walk. Their legs swelled grotesquely, resembling those of an elephant. Dust and starvation. During the summer, the combination of dry dust and starvation ravaged the prisoners' respiratory and digestive systems. B. The curse of contaminated water, dysentery, and diarrhea. The polluted Sweetwater Creek was both the source of life and the catalyst for mass death. By drinking this water, thousands of men contracted chronic diarrhea and dysentery, which spread rapidly through the densely packed camp. Mortality. Dysentery was the leading cause of death. Prisoners were often too weak to walk to the designated latrine areas. This spread disease rapidly, creating a devastating cycle of infection. Lack of medical aid. Confederate surgeons, like Dr. Joseph Jones, could do little more than count the dead. They had virtually no medicine, and the meager provisions available were inadequate. Only the most severely ill received any attention, while the majority were left to die in despair. C. The filth and despair. The primitive sanitation system, where the sewer and the drinking source were the same, forced prisoners to live in unimaginable filth. As the Georgia summer heat intensified, the stench of stagnant waste, human excrement, and decaying bodies made breathing itself a torment. The environmental degradation exacted a heavy toll on the prisoners, both mentally and physically. 2. Internal terror, the Raiders. The horrors of Andersonville were not confined to the cruelty of the Confederate authorities. One of the most tragic aspects was the internal terrorism created by the prisoners themselves. A. The rise of the gang. In this subhuman environment, humanity fractured. A core group of hardened, opportunistic prisoners organized into a criminal gang known as the Raiders. These men were often career criminals and rough military personnel who had been captured early in the war. Targets. The Raiders specifically targeted the weak and the newly arrived. They forcibly stole blankets, food, meager military supplies, shoes, and even precious personal items like rings. Anarchy. The Raiders were most active at night. They moved in groups, attacking the defenseless and the isolated. Their campaign of terror reached a point where the fear of the Raiders often surpassed the fear of the Confederate guards. B. The Regulators and the birth of justice. The anarchy created by the Raiders became so intolerable that a group of honest, disciplined prisoners organized a counterforce known as the Regulators. This group was led by men determined to restore order, notably Sergeant Finan Burke. Restoring order. The Regulators' goal was to establish justice and discipline within the camp. They began identifying the Raiders and forming patrols to counter their activities. C. Wears's approval and the trial. The internal violence escalated to such a degree that Captain Wears recognized the camp was slipping out of his control. Ironically, he authorized the Regulators to take action to restore basic discipline. The tribunal. In July 1864, with Wears's consent, the prisoners themselves convened a court to try the Raiders. 6 accused Raiders were brought before this tribunal of their fellow prisoners. Execution. After a swift trial, these 6 Raiders were found guilty and were hanged inside the camp by the Regulators. This execution was a brutal but defining moment in Andersonville's history. It proved that even in the deepest recesses of hell, there remained a human will to establish order and justice. After the Raiders were eliminated, a fragile peace returned to the camp, although the devastating impact of starvation and disease continued unabated. 3. The daily struggle for existence, shanties and brotherhood. Life at Andersonville was a constant wait for either death or a rare distribution of moldy rations. In this extreme context, prisoners developed ingenious strategies for survival. A. Constructing shelter, the shanties. Since the camp lacked barracks, prisoners relied on their ingenuity to build shelters known as the shanties. Materials. They dug holes in the ground, dugouts, and covered them with scavenged clothing, blankets, or pine branches to create temporary roofs. These shanties were the only source of limited shade during the intense heat and minimal protection during heavy rain. Fire and rain. Open fires were generally forbidden inside the stockade, leading to immense suffering from cold during the nights and winter. When summer rains came, the dugouts filled with mud and water. B. Scavenging and survival tactics. Due to the inadequate supplies, prisoners constantly devised innovative ways to supplement their diets. Scavenging. Prisoners rummaged through discarded waste near the cookhouses for the smallest scraps. They often hunted mice or snakes, anything that could provide meager protein. Hopewell. Many risked their lives to retrieve items thrown over the fence or to search for food along the banks of the creek. C. Glimmers of humanity and brotherhood. Amidst the pervasive darkness, small acts of human kindness shone through. Many prisoners shared their blankets and, more importantly, their meager rations. The bond of friendship became the main psychological lifeline. The sick were tended to, and the dying were offered prayers. These small acts of humanity prevented the tragedy from becoming absolute moral despair. 4. Camp expansion and the final peak of mortality. By August 1864, the situation at Andersonville reached its ultimate climax of disaster. A. Capacity overwhelmed. The initial capacity of Camp Sumter was 10,000 prisoners. By August, the population had swelled to over 32,000 men. Recognizing the crisis, the Confederate authorities expanded the camp by an additional 10 acres. The expanded space, Although the total area increased to 27 acres, this expansion did nothing to improve the supply of food, clean water, or medical care. The new space was immediately filled, and the overcrowding continued. B. The Providence Spring. In August 1864, the prisoners witnessed what they considered a miracle. After a massive rainstorm, a spring suddenly erupted from the ground near the center of the camp. Since the rest of the creek water was contaminated, the prisoners immediately dubbed this new, clean source the Providence Spring, God's gift. It saved countless lives and provided a desperate flicker of hope. C. The climate of death. By August, the mortality rate reached its terrifying peak, with nearly 130 deaths per day. The prison guards could barely keep up with the burial of the dead. The record. Over the 14 months of operation, more than 13,000 Union prisoners died at Andersonville. This meant that roughly 1 in every 4 men imprisoned there perished. The overwhelming cause of death remained malnutrition and disease. The news reaches north, Sherman's shadow, and the release. The narrative continues. As 1864 drew to a close, the misery of Andersonville reached its zenith. But external forces, the relentless advance of the Union Army, and the agonizing news reaching the North were finally converging to seal the camp's fate. Part 2 detailed the internal terror and the daily death toll within the stockade. Part 3 will focus on the external awareness of the atrocity, the logistical collapse that led to the camp's closure, and the horrific state of the men who survived to see freedom. 1. Whispers of horror. The news reaches the Union. Despite the best efforts of the Confederate government to suppress information about the camp's lethal conditions, word gradually began to filter back to Union lines and the Northern public. A. Escapees and testimony. A handful of resourceful prisoners managed to escape the stockade, traversing the vast, hostile Confederate territory to reach Union-held areas. Their physical appearance alone, skeletal, ravaged by disease, was shocking proof of the brutal conditions. The power of witness. When these escapees shared their stories, describing the starvation, the contaminated creek, the deadline, and the pile of unburied dead, their testimonies painted a picture of calculated cruelty that horrified the public. Official reports. Union General John Winder, responsible for the Confederate prison system, had died in 1864. But reports from Confederate surgeons themselves, such as Dr. Joseph Jones, confirmed the catastrophic mortality rates and abysmal sanitation, often blaming the poor health on the prisoners' own lack of personal hygiene rather than systemic starvation. B. Northern outrage and propaganda. The accounts of Andersonville fueled immense outrage in the North, galvanizing public support for the continuation of the war, not just to preserve the Union, but to avenge the suffering of the soldiers. Political pressure. Northern newspapers widely published the horrific details, often accompanied by drawings and engravings based on the descriptions. Andersonville became a powerful tool for anti-Confederate propaganda, symbolizing the moral depravity of the Southern cause. Calls for retaliation. There were widespread calls for retaliation and mistreatment of Confederate prisoners held in Northern camps, though Union policy officially forbade such actions. 2. The Great Exodus, relocation, and the final collapse. The relentless advance of General William T. Sherman's army through Georgia in the late summer and fall of 1864 forced the Confederate High Command to reluctantly accept that Camp Sumter was in the path of destruction. A. Sherman's March. As Sherman marched toward Atlanta and then embarked on his destructive march to the sea, the Confederacy realized that the presence of over 30,000 Union prisoners at Andersonville constituted both a logistical nightmare and a security risk. Security risk. Should Sherman's forces reach the camp, the freed, vengeful prisoners could easily join the Union Army, vastly swelling its ranks and morale. Closure decision. By September 1864, the Confederate authorities began the systematic process of relocating the prisoners. B. The unfolding disaster of relocation. The remaining prisoners, now severely weakened, were loaded onto boxcars and transported to other sites, primarily Camp Lawton, Millen, Georgia, and Florence Stockade, South Carolina. The journey itself was brutal, killing many who were already clinging precariously to life. The new camps, however, often quickly devolved into conditions almost as bad as Andersonville, though none reached its total death toll. Empty camp. By early 1865, Andersonville was largely empty of prisoners, save for the critically ill who were too weak to move. It became a silent, desolate graveyard, its pine walls a grim monument to the lives lost there. 3. The unfinished exchange and the Andersonville men. Late in the war, a partial, unofficial prisoner exchange was finally restarted as a humanitarian necessity, leading to the release of thousands of the most desperate survivors. A. The parolees. These men, known as parolees, were taken to Union receiving centers, most famously at Annapolis, Maryland. The sight of the survivors deeply shocked Union officials and the public. Physical state. The men were living skeletons, ravaged by scurvy, covered in lice and filth, and barely recognizable as soldiers. Many weighed less than 90 pounds, 40 kilograms. Their condition was so extreme that they were often referred to simply as the Andersonville men. Mental trauma. Beyond the physical wasting, the men suffered profound psychological trauma from the starvation, the cruelty, and the constant fear of the raiders and the deadline. Many were unable to fully recover and struggled with chronic health issues for the rest of their lives. B. Clara Barton and the identification effort. When the war ended, one of the most important humanitarian efforts began at the site of the prison itself, led by a dedicated woman. Graves and records. Upon entering Andersonville in the spring of 1865, Union soldiers found the cemetery containing the remains of the nearly 13,000 deceased prisoners. The graves were marked only by rough wooden stakes. Clarifying the record. Clara Barton, the famous humanitarian and future founder of the American Red Cross, arrived at the scene. Working tirelessly with former prisoner Dorrance Atwater, who had secretly kept a coded list of the dead, Barton led the effort to properly identify and mark the individual graves. This effort resulted in the identification of all but 460 of the 12,912 graves. This painstaking work gave the victims closure and solidified the record of the atrocity. 4. The final surrender and the arrest of Weirs. The fate of Andersonville was inextricably tied to the final defeat of the Confederacy. A. The war ends. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Camp Sumter was officially taken over by Union forces. B. The capture of Weirs. Captain Henry Weirs, who had remained at the site to oversee the final cleanup and administrative tasks, was identified and arrested by Union troops. He was deemed the primary individual responsible for the extreme suffering and death at the camp.
The reckoning, the trial, and the lasting legacy. The narrative concludes. The Civil War was over, but the wounds it inflicted were still raw, particularly the moral outrage sparked by the revelations from Andersonville. Part 3 detailed the arrival of Sherman's army, the chaotic release of the emaciated survivors, and the painstaking work of identifying the thousands of dead. Part 4 brings the story to its close, focusing on the highly controversial pursuit of justice against the camp's commandant and the ultimate legacy of the site as a perpetual memorial. 1. The call for vengeance, the arrest and charges. In the immediate aftermath of the war and the assassination of President Lincoln, the North sought swift justice for the atrocities committed during the conflict. Captain Henry Weirs became the symbolic target for the immense suffering of all Union prisoners of war. A. The arrest. Following the occupation of Camp Sumter, Captain Henry Weirs was identified by Union officials. He was placed under arrest and transported to Washington, D.C., where he was imprisoned at the Old Capitol Prison. Charges. Weirs was formally charged by a military commission with 2 counts. Conspiracy, conspiring with other Confederate officials, specifically naming General John Winder, who had died, Murder. Murdering Union soldiers through the systematic withholding of food and medicine, and by his own hand, though direct proof of personal murder was thin. B. The political context of the trial. Wirz's trial, which began in August 1865, was highly political and charged with public emotion. The North demanded a scapegoat for the suffering of its sons, and Wirz, a Swiss immigrant who commanded the camp, was an ideal candidate. Military commission. The trial was overseen by a military commission rather than a civilian court, a process criticized as being politically motivated and lacking some fundamental procedural fairness. Witness testimony. The prosecution relied heavily on the dramatic and often harrowing testimony of former Andersonville prisoners, whose accounts of starvation, filth, and the deadline deeply swayed public opinion and the commission itself. 2. The trial and the defense. The trial lasted for 2 months and became the most sensationalized legal proceeding of the Reconstruction era. A. Wirz's defense. Wirz's defense centered on the argument that he was a victim of circumstances far beyond his control. Supply collapse. His lawyers argued that the horrendous conditions were due to the collapse of the Confederate supply system and the extreme poverty of the South late in the war. They presented evidence, though largely dismissed by the commission, that Wirz had repeatedly petitioned Richmond for more food and medicine. Scapegoat theory. Wirz maintained that he was being used as a convenient scapegoat for the failings of the entire Confederate High Command and the inherent logistical impossibility of providing for 30,000 men in a dying nation. B. The verdict and execution. Despite evidence supporting the logistical failures, the political will to punish the atrocities was overwhelming. Guilty verdict. In November 1865, the military commission found Henry Wirz guilty on both counts of conspiracy and murder. Execution. On November 10, 1865, Captain Henry Wirz was publicly hanged in the yard of the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. He was the only Confederate official to be executed for war crimes stemming from the Civil War. His final words maintained his innocence regarding the deliberate murder of prisoners. The execution was viewed by many in the North as a necessary act of retribution and justice, but it remains a deeply controversial event in legal history, with many historians arguing that while Wirz was cruel, he was unjustly made to bear the sole responsibility for a massive systemic failure. 3. The National Cemetery and Memorialization. The immediate horror of the camp transformed into a solemn place of memory, ensuring the sacrifice of the 13,000 men would not be forgotten. A. The Andersonville National Cemetery. In the summer of 1865, the land surrounding the prison cemetery was consecrated as the Andersonville National Cemetery. Standardization. The efforts of Clara Barton and Dorrance Atwater had ensured that nearly all the graves were precisely identified and marked with uniform headstones. Final resting place. Today, the National Cemetery holds the graves of the Andersonville dead as well as American veterans from all conflicts, serving as a powerful reminder of the cost of war. B. The Andersonville National Historic Site. In the 20th century, the site was preserved and designated the Andersonville National Historic Site. The stockade reconstruction. Portions of the original stockade walls were reconstructed, and the deadline was marked, allowing visitors to visually grasp the claustrophobic and terrifying environment the prisoners endured. The POW Museum. A National Prisoner of War Museum was established on the site, broadening the memorial scope to honor all American POWs across all conflicts, framing the experience of the Andersonville men within the broader tradition of military sacrifice. 4. The Enduring Legacy. Anderson's legacy is complex and profound. It stands as a chilling symbol of man's inhumanity, the fragility of order, and the ethical responsibility of captors. The moral cost. Anderson permanently etched into the American consciousness the moral cost of the Civil War, emphasizing that the suffering extended beyond the battlefields into the grim reality of military captivity. Prisoner welfare. The atrocities led directly to greater international scrutiny regarding the treatment of prisoners of war, influencing later agreements and setting precedents for wartime accountability. A warning. Today, the silent open space within the original stockade walls serves as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power, systemic failure, and the ultimate necessity of humane treatment even in the most extreme circumstances. The 13,000 rows of white headstones stand as perpetual witnesses to the American reckoning that began, ironically, long after the cannons fell silent.